Former world-class water skier and cyclist Kristen Worley collaborated with journalist and author Johanna Schneller to write about her extraordinary life. The result is Woman Enough: How a Boy Became a Woman and Changed the World of Sport. And we're pleased to welcome Kristen and Johanna to our studio tonight. Hi.
Hey.
It's nice to meet you both.
Absolutely, it's wonderful to be here.
So Kristen, this book is very personal, a lot of pain. Were you at all nervous with how it would be received?
Absolutely. For me, it was an interesting timing as well when Johanna and I had connected. It's been almost 3 years by the time when we first met and were considering doing this, and then with the support of Penguin Random House. And for me, I was kind of in that kind of painful moment with some of the legal pieces I was doing with international sports. So there's a lot of already emotion and a lot of tension for me in having to that was kind of going on in my life that period in my life at that point in time. So during that development of the book, I was really concerned. But it's interesting now that I'm kind of at the release of the book. I'm kind of at a different place with it.
Is there like a sigh of relief, or just like, okay, that wasn't too bad?
It was the right thing to do.
Right.
And I wasn't sure when we had decided to do this, because there was a lot of emotion, a lot of personal things kind of going on in my life, and challenges going on. But now, again, looking at the other side of the fence and the response that we've been getting with the release of the book, it's been well received.
Johanna, I want to get you in a second, but I just want to read something from the book quickly. I want to read a passage from the book where you explain that Chris Jackson, the person who you once were, is described as a shy teenager, but that discovering his talent as a water skier allowed him to overcome some of that. You write, Chris had discovered that he could wear this new Chris, water skier Chris, like a suit of armor. Real Chris had real problems, but this shaggy-haired super skier party guy, people liked him. That persona offered him some protection. Looking back on that teenager, to what extent did he understand what he was trying to protect himself from?
At that point in time, didn't really know. Because at that time, back in those days, we didn't talk about these things. We didn't have a lot of knowledge and language around this area of diversity. And growing up in the environment that it is at that particular point in time, for me, it was all about self-discovery. And I knew that these things were kind of going on kind of sideways in my life, and having to kind of deal with my two identified lives in terms of my gender. But I was constantly trying to fight, trying to get back to that box, trying to get back to what was assumed that normal. And so by living my life in my water skiing years, I mean, I was that blonde-haired, curly-haired, blonde-haired kid with blue eyes, suntan body, and I happened to do well in a sporting environment, and where I did a lot of show skiing as well. So I was very much in the public eye in Canada, and internationally in my water skiing. So it kind of gave me that separation from my public persona to my personal reality.
And Johanna, how did you become involved in writing Woman Enough?
At the time, Kristen's and my agent were the same person, and she introduced us, and I knew absolutely nothing. Kristen was the first XY woman I ever really got to spend time with, and I said to her right from the beginning, you know, I could be an ideal person to tell this story for you because I am starting from scratch, and so I will be able to take the reader on that same journey that I'm going on, of like knowing nothing to knowing a little bit more. And all the things that I'm going to ask you questions about are going to be the same kinds of things that the readers are going to want to know. So,
So you were very cognitive about writing from, like, I guess what it would be like to write a book about XY woman, right?
Yeah, I mean, right from the start, it was always going to be Kristen's story, and that was my job was going to be just how best to kind of, try to open that story up and tell it in a way that would be true to herself, but also understandable for people who aren't familiar with this diversity and who want to learn more about the law piece and the sport piece. And, it had a lot of moving parts, this story. My background was mostly celebrity profiles and actors, and so I was familiar with trying to get people to trust me a little bit, people who'd been asked a lot of questions, people who had privacy to protect. And so I knew that would be useful in this. Kristen was super generous right from the start with what she was willing to say. But you know, as she mentioned, there was stuff that was not happy for her to recall. So there was painful stuff we had to get through.
Well, what was that process like for you, Kristen, to go into those spaces in your life and to share those intimate details in order for you to fully collaborate with Johanna?
Oh, it's interesting because to do that, it took us a period of time for us to trust each other. I mean, there was that, because we didn't know each other. We met purely for the first time. And it took we developed a friendship, a really fun friendship over the years, because we had to, because we almost spent 3 years together developing this in 6 to 8 hour sessions that we would spend together. And you know, at times, I know it became very emotional for me. Some things that we kind of hit on some days would go like this, going to come highs and lows in our conversations. And then all of a sudden we get on a string of conversation that all of a sudden just seemed to make sense for the story. And
Yeah, it was like these electric moments that were fantastic.
Yeah, and all of a sudden it was just like blah, you know, and it was just like boom, 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 boom. But it was some parts were very emotional. I mean, sometimes I'd be very tearful, you know,
Did you, so I'm guessing when that happened for you as a writer, as a journalist, I'm guessing that when something like that happened, did you write it or did you wait until everything? Like what was the process of writing the book like?
I think it would have been different if I'd been writing about Kristen, but knowing that it was going to be Kristen's voice, it was always very clear what the best thing for the book was. And the important thing, as Kristen said, was the mutual trust, and that does take a while for anybody to develop. But I feel like once we developed it, then we could go into those areas that were dangerous, I think, for Kristen to remember, just because while she was living them, it was very painful. She had put that behind her, so that it was painful to recall it all. And remember, as a young person, she spent a lot of her time not being who she truly was in public, even in private. And so to unearth all of that from a person who was used to protecting herself was just a painstaking, careful process. But I think we were always super respectful of one another and very careful with one another.
Yeah. But were there any points where maybe you had, because you have to write this book, maybe you had to push Kristen a little bit, or another parts maybe where you had to kind of pull back a little bit?
I think I had to push her along. I mean, I think she was very good about letting me push her, but I think there were a lot of times where I was like, you know, we have to, it's horrible, but we have to talk about this. We have to figure out a way to talk about this.
Because we'd actually take breaks. Like, I mean, sometimes we take week breaks because we get into a conversation that it was just too much. And I'd have to kind of recirculate in my mind because a lot of that stuff is locked away psychologically for myself. And then I needed to kind of think, as a designer, I'm a very visual person. And so when Johanna would kind of go down a specific path, it would trigger a lot of things for me. Things maybe I didn't even think about. And all of a sudden, multiple things get triggered. And it becomes very emotional. And for me, all of a sudden, I have to kind of stop talking about it.
Was it hard what was it like talking about the family that adopted you, the Jacksons? Was that challenging for you?
Oh, absolutely. Because I didn't. For me, because I was reliving. Like for me, I'm a very visual person. So for me, I'm reliving those moments, and so I feel it very physically in terms of. It's very raw for me that way. I think also it's almost very therapeutic for me, and I think it gave me relief because for so much it was locked up for so long.
So this writing a book, cathartic maybe.
Yeah.
Like it's
somewhat.
Somewhat.
Yes, yeah.
I found it really interesting the early parts of your life, the way that you wrote it in third person. Why did you approach telling that part of Kristen's life in the third person?
It became pretty clear pretty early on that I had these kind of notions about what it must be like to be born in the wrong body, you know, and that when finally the body and the brain are aligned, you know, it would be this whole like caterpillar butterfly metaphor, and you know, I had all these highfalutin notions, and every one I had, Kristen would be very calmly like, no, it wasn't like that, no. And so anytime that I would sort of go down this kind of grandiose road, she would always say like, no. But it became pretty clear that in the way she had lived her life and in the way a lot of people live their lives, there was a before and an after. And so it made perfect sense because that person that she was pretending to be all those years wasn't ever really the real her. it made sense that that would be the third person. And then the person, when she finally becomes who she was meant to be, becomes first person.
Kristen, how was telling Chris's story in the third person helpful for you?
At the time, I didn't think that way. I do now. Because
What did you think at the time?
well, for me, because at the time it was at the time when we first started going down this journey. For 20 years, I'd kind of locked that all away. That was kind of, to me, Chris had died. So for me to be able to move on in my life and kind of live that new persona, and plus, what a lot of people may not understand either is that you have to be, you have to recreate yourself, and you have to re-educate yourself and kind of re-socialize yourself as Kristen. So from where I was and where I was socialized as a young child, because what a lot of people may not understand is that this is happening from the very moment you're born and throughout your childhood, through your adolescence and through your teenagers. You're socially developed down that particular avenue as being either male or female. So for me, it was important for me at that time to kind of cut that off, so I could relearn and kind of re-educate myself and kind of re-socialize myself to become myself, to become Kristen. So until that very point in time, that had all been cut off.
Kristen, so one day you're watching a James Bond movie for your eyes only. How did that movie change your life?
It was an aha moment for me. Again, I was a teenager in my early teens, and it was when the movie came out, and the lead actress of the lead, who played next to I think it was Roger Moore at the time, was an actress from the UK who had transitioned, and I kind of put two and two together, and I kind of shocked myself, and I said, that can't be it. You know, it was too. I felt that it was too out there, and not believing what I was seeing on television. That was my journey that I would be taking, or potentially taking at the time.
And writing the book, Johanna, I'm guessing you had to do a lot of research into, I guess, what that dealt with gender dysphoria.
Oh, I had to do research on every facet of this book. It was hilarious because, you know, Kristen and I would sit down and do our sessions, and you know, Kristen knows a ton, and she introduced me to lots of people for the law aspect and the sport aspect and the science aspect. But I would come to those parts of writing the book, and it would just be like, well, I don't know who's going to write this part, because and then it would just be me having to go down that.
Well, what did you find? Because at the time, this was 20 years ago, and this would be at a moment when you were still Chris, and you were trying to figure out who you were.
Right, it was early transition. Right, it was beginning my transition.
Right. So what did you find about what was available?
Yeah, I mean, the remarkable thing about Kristen's story is that she had to do so much of this for herself. There were no mechanisms. There were no social, places where you could go and learn information about this stuff. It wasn't talked about. It certainly wasn't talked about in her family. The premier mental health facility in Toronto at the time was the Clark, which they now refer to as Jurassic Clark, because their policies that were setting the policy for the world at the time, we now would think of as terribly, terribly archaic and incorrect. And so that, part of what makes Kristen's story so remarkable is how self-made she is in terms of what she learned about law and sport and science and endocrinology and brain health and all the stuff that happens in the womb. And these are all pieces that she had to put together for herself, because no one else out there was going to be able to do that for her. So, she's a trailblazer in so many ways. And that was one of the things that made it so frustrating for her in dealing with all these people who were standing in her way. It's just like, I have found all this stuff out because I had to survive. Why don't you let me share this information with you? Like, why don't you let me help educate you, or at least introduce you to the people who can help educate you? Like, all Kristen's energy was directed toward, opening people up. And these were the same people who were interested in sort of shutting her down. So my research was just one shock after another of like, they said what? They did what? So, it was heartbreaking and also incredibly heartening when I think about what she was able to do.
And when in the book, when you're writing about Kristen, you used to do this thing called the switch.
Right.
And when you found that there was actually a name, gender dysphoria, how What did that feel like? That you actually had a term for what it is that you had been experiencing?
It was some relief. Because for me, because I experienced it all it wasn't until I was in my late teenage and early 20s that I actually got to acknowledge that type of acknowledgement. So I've been kind of living between the two genders since I was 3 and 4 years old, and kind of living two lives. And at that time, as you go through those, as you develop as a young person, as you get older, it becomes more and more intense because as I learned through that process, the ideas of gender dysphoria, which is they classified it, the indifference in terms of our gender, our brain makeup in terms of our gender, that it gave me some kind of qualification of what my situation was and what I'd been experiencing. But there's a point of reference too. There's a bit of sadness that went with it as well, because now I'm halfway through my life. And I wish I could have dealt with it at a much younger age, because I realized too, through that journey and the confusion and the intensity, and also within my own family, not having that education or support socially, let alone medically, it impacted my education, my own personal development, my own social development, and so on. Like it delayed things. And it was a point in time too, as we talk about in the book, is that my parents actually thought I had a learning problem. So from ages from grade 6 through to middle high school, I was taking education, like special ed courses, where at that time they'd pull you out of the classroom in front of all your other students in your class to put me through another either a math or English course. So it wasn't that I was having I wasn't having intellectual issues in terms of my capacity to be educated. But the issue was I was getting these cross-gender issues were implicating in my ability to socially engage at school. And so
Your brain was just busy coping.
my brain was more busy coping, and that's where sport came into it. But more importantly, it was more of a survival mechanism. So it's interesting hearing Johanna's perspective as we're just talking about the complexity of which I had to kind of delve in to get educated in this space, in dealing with the medical side, the sporting side, the legal, and also now working as a designer, is that there was such a misconnection to who I was as a person, theoretically at that time as a young boy, and how it was assumed that I was having educational issues, my ability to absorb information, where in fact it was just the confusion that I was having with my gender.
I want to read something else from the book. In the book, Woman Enough, you tell us that some people think transitioning is easy. You take some hormones, change your wardrobe, restyle your hair. Maybe you have surgery, maybe not. But instantly you're comfortable with your new life. That's the way it looks on TV, right? Those people are mistaken. Transitioning is a slow process, not just physiologically, but mentally and psychologically. Mine took 5 years. Those 5 years took place while you were married to Ali, who you quote as saying that she married a man, raised a teenager, and ended up with a wife. What impact did that relationship have on who you are today?
Wow. Do you want to? I actually would like hearing Johanna's perspective on it first.
It's a big relationship. And, Ali has always been in Kristen's life since I've known Kristen. And I always heard about Ali. But it was a full year before Kristen was able to say to me, well, Ali and I were married, right? So I knew they were friends, and I had suspected they had dated and everything. And I kept sort of saying, like, you can tell me about Ali whenever you're ready.
That's really
I knew
interesting.
There was something.
Why did you keep that
Well, it's part of all that unpacking, and that whole imagery. Part of it was because of my sporting world, is that within the journalistic world, and here we are talking about the simplicity of how it's this perspective of transition, how incorrect that is, in the ideals of sport. It's very similar to that, how it's protected by journalists around the world. So for a period of time, I was very negatively impacted by journalism. Like at one point, I felt like a chameleon, because a lot of journalistic views were very much on the simplicity of transition and thinking that there was some ideals of advantages in sport, which is not the truth, but instead of going down that path. So for me, it was more of a protection mechanism, one of Ali, the Worley family, and of my past history, because of the fears of people delving into my private life and my past life, and then the complexity of somebody who died, as we're talking about Chris, coming into that circle. And a lot of people don't understand the impactfulness of that history coming into my life and what it would have done to me. It would have devastated me as a person. And also, it wouldn't have allowed me to move on as Kristen. And so there's certain things that I had to do, certain mechanisms I had to do, also to protect my family in New Zealand and the simplicity of my Kiwi family, who are on the other side of the world.
That's your birth family.
That's my birth family, right. So the complexity of that and their simplicity of their lives. I had to seriously do specific things that disallowed people prying into my private life, especially with social media and the complexity of the internet now. How easy it is to get information on people.
Yeah. And it's also this notion that, Kristen was very clear that one thing that a lot of people don't think about when someone transitions is that, you're bringing the people from your old life into your new life. And that, as loving as people want to be, sometimes other people are struggling with that too. And the idea of making it as easy as possible, one of the things Kristen said, even as simple as your name, from Chris to Kristen, people could still call her Chris and it would be okay. Like just that notion of trying to bring people along and protect people, think about other people, protect yourself, think about yourself. I think all of that was tied up with you and Allie, and I think it was just, it's a love story, but it's not a love story that we traditionally hear. And so I think just, again, getting to that point of trust where you could actually understand these were two people who fell in love. They went through this enormous thing together, and they still love each other very much, just in a different way now. Not everybody will get that immediately. And I think Kristen had to come to the point where she could trust me with that story.
What most surprised you about how Allie responded to Kristen's transition to an XY woman?
Allie is, I can't imagine a better partner. I can't imagine your life without her, or I really do think that there are a couple heroes in this story, and Kristen's one, and Allie's definitely another.
Yeah.
Just the idea that she saw kind of what needed to be done. And when you love someone, you love them, and you love whatever they're going through. And it's the kind of love that we wish we could all have in our life. Not everybody's capable of it. She's an amazing woman.
We only have a few minutes left, but in the book, we hear that gender is complicated. What greater understanding of it do you think you have as a result of having been a part of this book?
One of the things that was very clear to me was talking to Dr. Dick Schwab, who's a really preeminent brain scientist out of Amsterdam. He's very clear that there's a lot of things that happen between the brain and the sex organs in the womb, and that there's a circular kind of communication between your ovaries or testicles and your brain, and that communication is complicated, and many things can go in many different directions along the way. And that these are things that are embedded in sort of every cell of your body, in your brain. And for people who still persist in believing that it's a choice, science is telling us that that is very old thinking and that we really have to move on from that. But we accept infinite variation in every other aspect of our lives. The way people look, the way people behave, the sound of our voice, the color of our hair, and it only makes sense. So many things are happening inside of us during that, gestation. Of course, there's going to be variations on every level of the human experience, and this is just one of them. And the other thing I think that Kristen showed me is obviously the opposite of love is not hate. The opposite of love is fear. And there are people who still approach a lot of these issues with a lot of fear. And it would be so much simpler for everybody if we could approach them with empathy instead, I think.
And this is something that is in the book, and you had a really difficult time approaching your adoptive parents to speak about this. What advice would you offer to parents who might have to have this conversation, but they don't know how to have it?
I think, first of all, to listen to their children. I think, first of all, I think, be there for your children and love your children and listen to what they're telling you. Even if some of it's the most difficult conversation, and spend that time. It's when the taps turn off was when it comes a problem, and the child isn't being heard, and that was my experience. And the issue is, mine was mine was also generational as well, a little bit, in support of the Jackson, my adoptive family, somewhat, let alone our family structure. But the issue is, society's moved on, and because of the people like Dick Schwab and others in the world that are some of the leading this conversation, that there is a lot more resources out there, and I think for parents, even if it's this issue or other issues, I think it's being connected to your child, listening to your child, listening to what they're telling you, and allowing them to be. And there's no right or wrong. And I think there's also a social construct for a lot of parents to kind of fit into what either their friends or their colleagues or their neighbors are about, to kind of fit into that grouping. And I think sometimes a lot of parents get caught up in that, and unfortunately, and not recognizing to be different is a good thing. And as I say often, what I thought was my worst nightmare, that this diversity that I was given, I now look at it as probably my greatest gift.
And I think that's the best way to end it. Johanna, thank you so much for being here with Kristen. This is such an important book, and I know that it's going to help a lot of people understand. I know it's a lot of pain, but your pain is a gift to the world in a way. Thank you so much for being here. And we've even spoken about half the things in the book, so you're going to be coming back onto the show. We'll talk about the court case, your athletic life.
Absolutely.
And much more.
But more about the sports stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Kristen.
You bet.
Johanna.
Thank you so much.
Thank
It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.